The night before my medical school interview, my sister poured bleach all over my only blazer just to teach me a lesson. My parents told me to stop making a scene and apologize to her. I wore the ruined jacket anyway. But when the dean of admissions looked at the exposed lining of my bleached blazer and then looked at my last name, his entire expression changed. He stood up trembling and asked if I was really her daughter. Before I tell you how a ruined piece of clothing exposed a 25-year-old lie and brought down my family's entire fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family. My name is Carmen, and I am 33 years old. For the last 10 years, I have worked grueling 12-hour shifts as an intensive care unit nurse in Boston. I spent my 20s draining myself physically and financially to support my adoptive family. They lived in a sprawling suburban mansion while I rented a tiny apartment and survived on cheap noodles. I always thought I owed them for taking me in. I had no idea my entire life was a carefully constructed trap designed to keep me poor and compliant. It all unraveled on a freezing Tuesday evening in November. I had driven to my parents' house for our mandatory weekly family dinner. The dining room table was set with expensive crystal and fine china. My adoptive parents, Howard and Sylvia, sat at the head of the table. My younger sister Paige and her husband Kendrick sat across from me. Kendrick is a 32-year-old African-American man who constantly brags about being a billionaire tech startup founder. He wears tailored suits and drives luxury cars, but somehow he and Paige always need to borrow money for their basic living expenses. Kendrick loved using words like synergy and disruptive algorithms, but whenever the check arrived at a restaurant, he suddenly forgot his wallet. Paige is 29 and the undisputed golden child of the family. She has never worked a real job in her life and treats my bank account like her personal emergency fund. I had been waiting all evening for the right moment to share my news. My hands were shaking with excitement under the table. I took a deep breath and announced that I had just secured an interview for the top medical school in Massachusetts. I had been studying for the entrance exams in secret for 2 years, working overnight shifts just to pay for prep courses. I expected at least a polite smile or a simple congratulations. Instead, the room went dead silent. Kendrick scoffed loudly and swirled his expensive bourbon. He looked at me with pure amusement. Medical school at 33. He laughed. You are going to be a resident fetching coffee alongside kids young enough to be your nieces. Stick to changing bedpans, Carmen. You are aging out of the workforce anyway. I felt my face flush, but I kept my voice steady. I told him that age brings experience, and my 10 years in the intensive care unit made me a stronger candidate than most. I had practically run the critical care floor during the worst health crises of the last decade. I had saved lives while young doctors were still trying to read their charts. I said I was finally doing something for my own future. Paige slammed her silver fork down onto her plate. She rolled her eyes and said my timing was incredibly selfish. She complained that she had an actual important announcement to make. She and Kendrick were planning their baby moon to the Maldives, and they needed me to hand over $15,000 to cover the resort fees. She said they were tight on liquid cash because Kendrick was supposedly preparing his tech company to go public. I stared at her in absolute disbelief. I told her I could not give her $15,000 for a luxury vacation. I explained that every penny of my savings was now strictly reserved for my medical school tuition and living expenses. I said I was completely done funding their lavish lifestyle while I drove a 12-year-old car with a broken heater. My adoptive mother, Sylvia, immediately jumped to Paige's defense. Her face turned red with anger. She pointed a manicured finger at me and raised her voice. We took you in when you were a literal orphan with nothing. You were a charity case, Carmen. We gave you a roof over your head and a respected family name. You owe this family everything you have. Your sister is pregnant, and you are going to deny her a safe, stress-free vacation just so you can chase some delusional fantasy. Sylvia loved to remind me of my origins. She always made sure I felt like a stray dog she had graciously allowed onto her pristine white carpets. Growing up, she gave Paige private tutors and ballet lessons while I was handed a mop and told to earn my keep. My adoptive father, Howard, agreed with her. He crossed his arms and told me I was being ungrateful and arrogant. He said nursing was a perfectly fine job for someone of my background and that I had no business trying to become a doctor. He demanded I transfer the money to Kendrick by Friday or face severe consequences. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. I looked at the back of the empty chair next to me. Hanging there was my freshly ironed navy blue blazer. It was not a designer brand, but it was the only professional piece of clothing I owned. More importantly, it was a hand-me-down from my late biological mother. It was the only physical item I had left of her. I had brought it with me straight from the dry cleaners, so it would be perfect for my interview the next morning. Paige followed my gaze. She looked at the blazer and then looked back at me with a cold, calculating glare. She picked up her heavy glass of red wine and stood up from her chair. The tension in the dining room became suffocating. I did not know it yet, but the events of the next few hours would completely shatter my reality and expose the most twisted betrayal I could ever imagine. Paige set her heavy wine glass down on the pristine dining table and stormed off, claiming she felt sick from my selfishness. I stayed behind to clear the dishes, because that was what I always did. I was the built-in maid for this family, and they never let me forget it. After scrubbing their plates in the sink, I walked down the hallway to grab my things and leave. The sharp and toxic smell of chemical bleach hit my lungs before I even turned the corner. I rushed into the adjacent laundry room and froze. Paige was standing right there under the harsh fluorescent light. She held an industrial-sized bottle of bleach in her manicured hands. My navy blue blazer lay crumpled inside the deep utility sink. A massive, jagged white stain was rapidly eating through the dark wool fabric. The bleach hissed and bubbled as it soaked deep into the fibers, completely destroying the only professional garment I owned. Paige looked up at me and smirked. She tilted her head and offered a fake, sympathetic pout. "Oops, I guess you cannot go to that interview now." She tossed the empty plastic bottle onto the tile floor. It clattered loudly and rolled against the washing machine. She crossed her arms and told me that maybe if I had been a supportive sister and funded her luxury baby moon, she would not have been so incredibly clumsy while doing the laundry. I felt a blinding rage surge through my entire body. I lunged forward and pulled the soaking wet jacket from the sink. The fabric felt heavy and ruined. The harsh chemicals burned my bare hands, but I did not care. I screamed at her, demanding to know what was wrong with her mind. I told her that blazer was the only physical item I had left from my biological mother before she passed away. It was not just a piece of clothing. It was my armor for the most important day of my career. My shouting echoed down the hallway and quickly drew the rest of the house. Howard and Sylvia marched into the laundry room with Kendrick trailing right behind them. I desperately expected my adoptive parents to be horrified by what Paige had deliberately done. Instead, Howard pointed a harsh, rigid finger directly at my face. "Stop making a scene over a cheap jacket, Carmen." He barked the order as if I was a misbehaving toddler throwing a tantrum. He told me I was purposely upsetting my pregnant sister and creating unnecessary drama. I stood there, dripping toxic bleach onto my shoes, staring at the people who claimed to be my family. Sylvia crossed her arms and glared at me with absolute disgust. She said if I wanted to replace that ragged piece of clothing, I needed to stop acting like a spoiled brat and start acting like a team player. That was the exact moment Howard pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase. He slammed them down onto the washing machine right next to my ruined blazer. "Sign the $2 million SBA loan guarantor form for Kendrick right now or get out of my house," Howard demanded. He tapped the signature line with his expensive gold pen. Kendrick stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He flashed his signature salesman smile, trying to manipulate the tension. He used his slick tech startup voice to explain that his company was on the verge of a massive breakthrough. He talked fast, throwing around buzzwords like disruptive algorithms and market synergy. He claimed he just needed someone with a spotless 10-year employment record and perfect credit to back the federal loan. He promised I would not have to pay a single dime and that this was just a minor bureaucratic formality. The pieces suddenly clicked together in my mind. The mandatory family dinner, the sudden pressure for money, the destroyed jacket. It was all a highly calculated setup. They knew I desperately needed my savings for medical school, so they decided to break me down emotionally until I submitted. They wanted to tie my pristine financial record to Kendrick and his shady business ventures. I knew exactly what a small business administration loan entailed. If Kendrick defaulted, the federal government would garnish my nursing wages for the rest of my life. My medical school dreams would be instantly vaporized by a $2 million debt that I did not even create. I looked Kendrick dead in the eye and told him his tech company was nothing but a hollow scam. I turned to my adoptive father and flatly refused to sign. I said I would rather walk into my medical school interview completely naked than attach my social security number to a federal fraud scheme. Howard turned dark purple with rage. He grabbed my shoulder and physically shoved me toward the back door. He shouted that I was an ungrateful parasite. He said he should have left me to rot in the foster care system when he had the chance. Sylvia yelled that I was dead to them. She told me not to bother coming back when my medical school fantasy inevitably failed because I was too old and too stupid to ever become a doctor. Paige just stood in the background leaning against Kendrick and giggling at my total humiliation. The heavy wooden door slammed shut right in my face. The deadbolt clicked loudly, locking me out. I was standing on the back porch in the middle of a brutal Boston winter night. The temperature was well below freezing, and the wind whipped violently through the bare trees. I did not even have my winter coat because it was still hanging inside their hallway closet. All I held in my freezing hands was my car key and the soaking wet bleached blazer. I stumbled across the icy driveway toward my 12-year-old Honda Civic. My teeth chattered uncontrollably as I unlocked the door and climbed into the driver's seat. The car engine sputtered and coughed before finally turning over, but the heater was completely broken and blew only frigid air. I sat in the freezing darkness of the suburban street. The strong, overwhelming smell of bleach filled the cramped space of the car, burning my eyes. I draped the ruined blazer over the steering wheel. The massive white stain looked like a permanent, ugly scar across the dark fabric. I had no money for a last-minute hotel room. I had no other professional clothes to wear tomorrow. I curled my legs up to my chest and wrapped my arms tightly around myself, shivering violently as the snow began to fall against the windshield. But as I sat there alone in the freezing cold, a fierce, unbreakable determination ignited deep in my chest. They wanted to destroy my confidence and ruin my interview. They wanted me to crawl back to their front door begging for forgiveness and ready to sign my life away. I looked at the ruined blazer and made a silent, absolute vow. I was going to wear this exact jacket tomorrow morning. I was going to walk into that prestigious university and look the admissions committee right in the eye. They thought they had broken me, but they had only handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear their entire fake empire to the ground. The freezing Boston morning broke through the frosted windows of my Honda Civic with a harsh, glaring light. My entire body ached from spending the night cramped in the driver's seat. My breath formed white clouds in the freezing air of the car cabin. I looked down at the passenger seat where the navy blue blazer lay. The bleach had completely dried overnight, leaving a massive, jagged white crater that stretched from the left lapel down to the waist. The harsh chemical had eaten entirely through the outer layer of the wool, leaving the inner silk lining completely exposed to the cold air. I did not cry. I did not feel sorry for myself. I grabbed the ruined jacket and pulled it over my shoulders. The fabric felt stiff and smelled heavily of industrial cleaning chemicals. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked like a woman who had just survived a war. I started the engine, feeling the familiar sputter of the old transmission, and drove straight toward the university campus. I was going to my medical school interview, and I was going to look them right in the eye. The medical school admissions building was a massive, imposing structure made of pristine white marble and polished glass. Walking through the heavy front doors felt like crossing into a completely different universe. The lobby was filled with the soft hum of classical music and the quiet, confident chatter of other applicants. They were all in their early 20s, fresh out of elite undergraduate programs. They stood in small groups, holding expensive leather portfolios and wearing perfectly tailored custom suits. When I walked into the waiting area, the entire room went completely silent. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the lobby. I could feel dozens of eyes locking onto me. The other applicants stared at my ruined jacket with absolute shock. A few of them actually stepped back as I walked past them, pulling their expensive coats closer to their bodies, as if poverty was a contagious disease. Two young women sitting near the reception desk whispered to each other, covering their mouths and gesturing toward the massive white bleach stain on my chest. I walked directly to the admissions desk. The receptionist looked at me with wide eyes and visible disdain. She hesitated before taking my name, checking her computer screen multiple times, as if she expected me to be a homeless person wandering in off the cold streets. I gave her my name with a steady, clear voice. She handed me a visitor badge using only the tips of her fingers to avoid touching me and pointed toward a row of chairs. I sat down holding my head high, refusing to slouch or hide the damage. I let them stare. After 45 agonizing minutes, a woman in a crisp white lab coat called my name. I stood up and followed her down a long corridor into a massive oak-paneled conference room. 3 senior doctors sat behind a long, polished table. Their faces were stern and deeply professional. When they looked up from my file and saw my jacket, their expressions instantly hardened. The lead interviewer, an older man with silver hair, frowned and adjusted his glasses. He asked if I had been involved in some sort of accident on the way to the campus. I looked at him calmly and told him no accident occurred. I explained that I had faced a severe personal challenge the night before, but my dedication to becoming a physician meant I would never let a ruined piece of clothing stop me from showing up. I asked them to judge me on my decade of medical experience rather than the state of my jacket. They exchanged highly skeptical glances, but the lead interviewer nodded and opened my file. If they thought my appearance meant I was unprepared, they were massively mistaken. They tried to break me down with grueling, complex medical scenarios. They threw questions at me about pharmacology, advanced pathology, and critical care decision-making. They asked how I would handle a patient coding from severe septic shock while managing a simultaneous airway emergency. I did not hesitate for a single second. I had spent 10 years in the intensive care unit fighting for lives on the brink of death. I answered their questions with absolute flawless precision. I detailed the exact dosage of vasopressors I would administer. I explained the precise physiological pathways of the diseases they questioned me about. I spoke with the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who had stood over flatlining patients and brought them back from the edge. Slowly, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The disdain on their faces faded and was replaced by genuine rapt attention. They stopped looking at the massive bleach stain and started looking me right in the eyes. I was not just another privileged kid, fresh out of a biology lab. I was a seasoned medical veteran who knew exactly what it meant to hold a human life in my hands. The lead interviewer actually smiled and leaned forward, clearly impressed by my extensive clinical knowledge. We were deep into a discussion about cardiovascular protocols when the heavy wooden door at the back of the conference room suddenly opened. The 3 interviewers immediately sat up straighter, showing deep respect. Dr. Gregory Pierce, the dean of the medical school, stepped into the room. He was a tall, commanding figure known across the country for his rigorous standards and zero tolerance for nonsense. He had come to observe the final phase of the interview. He stood silently by the door, listening to me finish my explanation of a complex cardiac rhythm. I kept my voice steady and professional, concluding my answer perfectly. Dr. Pierce nodded in approval, but as he began to walk toward the table, his footsteps suddenly slowed. He stopped completely. His eyes had locked onto my jacket. He was not looking at the ugly white bleach stain. He was staring directly at the exposed inner lining where the harsh chemicals had completely eaten away the top layer of navy wool. The ruined fabric revealed the vintage silk underneath. Dr. Pierce took a step closer, his face turning completely pale. He ignored the 3 interviewers who were watching him in confusion. He walked right up to my chair, breathing heavily as he stared at the exposed silk lining. His eyes traced the intricate design that had been hidden beneath the wool for decades. He looked from my jacket up to my face, and his entire expression changed from professional curiosity to absolute, overwhelming shock. The silence in the grand conference room became absolutely deafening. The 3 senior doctors who had just been grilling me about advanced cardiovascular protocols now sat completely frozen in their leather chairs. They watched in sheer confusion as Dr. Gregory Pierce, the highly respected dean of the medical school, stood just inches away from me. He was not looking at my face. He was not looking at the impressive resume resting on the table. His eyes were entirely locked onto the gaping white hole in my navy blazer. The industrial bleach Page had poured over my jacket had eaten straight through the cheap wool exterior. It had melted away the dark fabric and exposed the hidden layer underneath. It was a panel of vintage pristine silk, and woven directly into that silk, shimmering under the bright fluorescent lights of the interview room, was a meticulously embroidered gold crest. It was a large intertwined letter V, surrounded by a wreath of golden oak leaves. Dr. Pierce raised a trembling hand and pointed at my chest. "Where did you get that jacket?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed off the oak-paneled walls. I felt a sudden rush of defensiveness. I thought he was mocking my ruined clothes. I squared my shoulders and looked him right in the eye. I told him I did not buy it. I told him it was a hand-me-down from my late biological mother. I explained that she passed away when I was a very young child, and it was the only physical item I had left to remember her by. I stated firmly that regardless of the bleach stain, I wore it today because I wanted a piece of her with me. Dr. Pierce did not blink. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like he had just seen a ghost. He took a shaky breath and asked me for my biological mother's first name. I frowned, feeling a deep sense of confusion. Elise, I answered simply. Dr. Pierce gripped the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles turned white. Elise Vanderbilt, he asked the question with such intense reverence that the other 3 doctors in the room audibly gasped. You are Elise Vanderbilt's daughter. I sat perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs. Vanderbilt. I had never heard that last name before. My adoptive parents, Howard and Sylvia, had always told me my mother was a nameless transient. They told me she was a woman who died on the streets with absolutely nothing to her name. They claimed they rescued me from the gutters out of the goodness of their hearts. They changed my last name to theirs and spent my entire life making sure I knew how worthless my origins were. I shook my head and told Dr. Pierce that there must be some mistake. I explained what my adoptive family had always told me about my mother being a nobody. Dr. Pierce stood up straight and turned to the 3 senior doctors. Leave us, he ordered. The doctors did not hesitate for a single second. They gathered their files and hurried out of the room, pulling the heavy wooden doors shut behind them. We were completely alone. Dr. Pierce walked over to the nearest chair and sat down heavily. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes before looking back at me. Carmen, he said with a voice full of heavy emotion, your mother was not a nobody. Dr. Elise Vanderbilt was a legend in the halls of this very hospital. She was one of the most brilliant cardiovascular pioneers in the history of American medicine. My mind started to spin. I grabbed the edges of my chair, trying to ground myself. Dr. Pierce pointed toward the medical scenarios we had just been discussing. The cardiovascular stents you use every single day in the intensive care unit, the ones that keep your critically ill patients alive. Your mother invented them. She designed the prototype right here on this campus. She patented the technology before she died tragically in a car accident 25 years ago. I felt the breath leave my lungs. For 10 years, I had worked grueling overnight shifts in the ICU. For 10 years, I had held those exact life-saving devices in my hands, carefully inserting them to stabilize dying patients. I had been touching my own mother's legacy every single day, and I had absolutely no idea. I had spent my entire life believing I was a burden, a charity case, a stray dog taken in by a generous suburban family. But Dr. Pierce was not finished. He leaned forward and clasped his hands together on the table. He explained that when someone patents a medical device used in every hospital across the globe, it generates an incomprehensible amount of money. He told me that before she died, Elise Vanderbilt established a massive ironclad trust fund to protect her royalties. The university holds a seat on the board of trustees for that fund. Dr. Pierce explained, his voice growing sharp with growing realization. For 2.5 decades, the legal team has classified the primary heir of the Vanderbilt estate as missing. The private investigators could never locate you because your name was changed and your identity was completely obscured. A cold, hard knot formed in the pit of my stomach. If I was the missing heir, why had I spent my 20s eating cheap ramen noodles and sleeping in my 12-year-old car? Why was I currently working myself to the bone to pay for medical school, while my sister Paige flaunted designer bags and her husband Kendrick drove a brand new Porsche? I looked at Dr. Pierce and told him my adoptive parents lived in a massive multi-million-dollar mansion. I told him they funded Kendrick's fake tech startup. I told him they constantly had hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid cash to spend on luxury vacations while demanding I pay them back for the food I ate as a child. Dr. Pierce's expression darkened into something incredibly dangerous. He realized exactly what I was realizing. He looked at me with absolute dead seriousness. Carmen, the Vanderbilt Trust Fund is currently valued at over $80 million. The trust mandates a monthly living stipend for the guardian of the child until the heir turns 35. Dr. Pierce did not waste another second. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder and guided me out of the massive conference room. We walked briskly down the pristine marble corridors of the medical school, completely ignoring the stares of the other applicants still sitting in the lobby. My mind was racing so fast I could barely feel my feet touching the floor. He led me into his private executive suite and locked the heavy oak doors behind us. The room was lined with medical journals and awards, but my eyes were drawn to the large mahogany desk in the center. Dr. Pierce walked straight to his phone and hit a speed dial button. He put the call on speaker. A crisp, professional voice answered immediately. It was David Caldwell, the senior legal counsel for the University Board of Trustees. Dr. Pierce did not bother with pleasantries. He told David to pull up the sealed files for the Elise Vanderbilt estate right now. He announced that he had just found the missing heir sitting in his interview chair. I heard the frantic clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. For a few agonizing moments, the only sound in the office was the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock. Then David spoke, his voice tight with disbelief. He confirmed he had the file open. He read the numbers out loud, and the sheer magnitude of them made my knees weak. The Vanderbilt Trust, generated exclusively from the cardiovascular stent patents my biological mother held, was currently valued at just over $80 million. But that was not the part that made my blood run completely cold. David continued reading the stipulations of the trust. He explained that my mother had designed the fund to unlock fully when I turned 35. In the meantime, the trust mandated a massive living allowance specifically designated for my care. The estate had been automatically dispersing $30,000 every single month for the past 25 years. That money was legally earmarked to provide me with elite private schooling, luxury housing, and top-tier medical care. I grabbed the edge of the leather chair I was sitting in. $30,000 a month. I told the lawyer that I grew up wearing Paige's discarded clothes. I told him I worked double shifts at a diner just to pay for my nursing textbooks. I told him I had slept in my freezing car last night because I refused to sign a fraudulent federal loan document for my arrogant brother-in-law. Dr. Pierce looked at the speakerphone. He asked David how this was possible. He asked how the estate investigators had never found me if a monthly check was being cashed. The sound of typing resumed on the other end of the line, faster and more aggressive this time. David asked for the exact legal names of the people who raised me. I gave him Howard and Sylvia's full names. A heavy, thick silence fell over the call. When David finally spoke, his tone had shifted from professional curiosity to absolute disgust. I explained that Howard and Sylvia never legally adopted me. An official adoption would have triggered a massive background check and federal oversight. Instead, they manipulated a broken family court system to establish a permanent fraudulent guardianship. Within weeks of securing that guardianship, they petitioned a local judge to change my last name, claiming it was necessary to protect me from dangerous relatives. They actively severed my identity from the Vanderbilt name on all public records. They made me a ghost. But they kept the guardianship active behind closed doors. They used that specific legal loophole to quietly route the $30,000 monthly stipends directly into their own private accounts. They created a maze of shell corporations and fake routing numbers to hide the money from tax authorities. The sickening truth crashed over me like a tidal wave. My entire life of poverty and emotional abuse was a deliberate, calculated setup. Howard and Sylvia were not generous suburbanites who rescued a stray child. They were sophisticated criminals. They stole my identity and siphoned millions of dollars from my dead mother to fund their lavish lifestyle. They bought their massive mansion with my money. They bought Paige her designer bags and luxury cars with my money. Kendrick was funding his fake tech startup and buying expensive bourbon using the exact funds that were meant to keep me safe. They treated me like a worthless burden because they needed me to believe I was nothing. If I had confidence, if I had resources, if I ever demanded independence, I might have asked the wrong questions. They kept me exhausted and financially drained, so I would never have the strength to look into my own past. They needed me compliant and terrified just to keep their golden goose alive. Dr. Pierce slammed his fist onto his desk. He demanded David immediately draft the paperwork to freeze every single asset connected to Howard and Sylvia. He said he wanted the Federal Bureau of Investigation involved by noon. I stood up from the leather chair. The initial shock had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. I did not want to cry. I did not feel like a victim anymore. I looked down at the bleached blazer I was wearing. The gold Vanderbilt crest gleamed against the ruined fabric. Dr. Pierce looked at me with deep concern. He offered to have campus security escort me to a luxury hotel. He promised the university legal team would handle Howard and Sylvia quietly and ruthlessly. I shook my head. I told him I did not want this handled quietly. I wanted them to look me in the eye. I gathered my purse and adjusted my ruined jacket. I told Dr. Pierce I needed to make a quick stop at the suburban mansion to collect the rest of my belongings before the financial freeze hit their bank accounts. I wanted to see their faces when they still thought they held all the power. Armed with the truth, my real name and the backing of a multi-billion-dollar university legal team, I walked out of the dean's office and headed straight back into the freezing Boston winter, ready to burn their fake empire to the ground. I drove my freezing car through the heavy iron gates of the upscale suburban neighborhood. Every massive brick house and perfectly manicured lawn I passed made my stomach turn with absolute disgust. For my entire life, I had believed Howard and Sylvia earned their extreme wealth through relentless hard work. I had spent my 20s feeling like a heavy financial burden they had generously tolerated. Now I knew the sickening truth. Every imported sports car and luxury landscaping project in this exclusive zip code was a stark reminder of the $80 million legacy they had stolen from my biological mother. I pulled up to the curb outside their sprawling suburban mansion and turned off the engine. Standing right in the center of the heated cobblestone driveway was my brother-in-law Kendrick. He was wearing a custom-tailored wool overcoat and a ridiculously expensive gold watch that caught the harsh winter sunlight. He was leaning casually against the hood of a brand-new midnight black Porsche. I was loudly bragging to a wealthy neighbor across the property line. I was using his slick tech startup voice, talking aggressively about seed funding rounds and angel investors scaling his visionary platforms. The neighbor nodded politely before turning around and heading inside to escape the freezing wind. I stepped out of my car and the cold air hit my face. I was still wearing my ruined navy blazer. The massive bleach stain dominated the front of the jacket, but the gold Vanderbilt crest was completely visible on the exposed silk lining. Kendrick was too self-absorbed to even look closely at my clothes. When he heard my car door shut, he turned his head and let out a loud, mocking laugh. He pushed himself off the hood of his new sports car and stepped directly into my path, blocking me from reaching the front door of the mansion. He looked me up and down with absolute contempt. He told me I had some serious nerve coming back to the house after the pathetic tantrum I threw last night. He crossed his arms and said he assumed I had crawled back to beg Howard and Sylvia for forgiveness. He pointed a rigid finger at my chest and told me I was acting like a jealous loser. He said I was probably freezing and starving because I chose to be a stubborn, ungrateful brat instead of a supportive team player for the family. I did not say a single word. I just stared at him with a perfectly calm expression. My total silence seemed to deeply irritate him. He dropped his arms and leaned in close to my face, trying to intimidate me. He told me I really should have just signed those Small Business Administration loan documents last night when Howard gave me the chance. He said it would have saved us all a lot of unnecessary drama and prevented me from sleeping in the cold like a stray animal. Then his arrogant smirk grew even wider. He dropped his voice into a cruel, sinister whisper. He told me that my refusal did not actually matter anyway. Kendrick proudly confessed that he did not actually need my physical signature to get his money. He revealed that he had found an old tax return form inside Howard's home office desk a few weeks ago. He said he took high-resolution photos of my social security number and all my personal banking details. While I was sleeping in my freezing car last night, he went online and finalized a $500,000 federal business loan. He listed me as the primary financial guarantor without my consent. He patted the shiny hood of the new Porsche. He bragged that the federal funds had cleared his accounts bright and early this morning. He told me he used the very first withdrawal to buy the sports car in cash just to celebrate his own genius. He stepped back and laughed right in my face. He told me I was now legally on the hook for $500,000 to the United States government. He said the federal authorities would garnish my nursing wages for the next 40 years. He called me a broke, uneducated dropout who would be working double shifts in the intensive care unit until the day I died just to pay off his luxury lifestyle. I fully expected me to break down crying. He expected me to fall to my knees and panic. He expected the same terrified, compliant woman they had been emotionally abusing for 2 decades. He wanted me to beg him to reverse the loan. Instead, I let out a low, steady laugh. The sound completely threw him off guard. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I looked at the expensive sports car, and then I looked Kendrick right in the eye. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I spoke with the icy authority of a woman who held the absolute power to destroy his entire existence. I told him he had just made a massive miscalculation. I explained that using my social security number to secure federal funds was not just a clever trick to punish a broke nurse. I told him he had just committed federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft against the primary heir of the Elise Vanderbilt estate. His eyes darted downward, finally noticing the intricate gold crest embroidered into the silk lining of my blazer. The color slowly began to drain from his face as the heavy weight of the Vanderbilt name registered in his mind. I gave him a chillingly calm smile and told him to enjoy the Porsche while he still could. Kendrick stood completely frozen next to the gleaming hood of his brand new Porsche. His arrogant smirk had vanished the exact second his eyes locked onto the gold-embroidered crest exposed on the lining of my bleached blazer. His mind was rapidly calculating the sheer horror of his situation. He had just stolen $500,000 in federal funds using the social security number of a Vanderbilt heiress. He knew the federal government did not offer payment plans or polite warnings for wire fraud. They offered decades in federal prison. Before Kendrick could utter a single word, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion swung open with a violent crash. Paige marched out onto the sweeping front porch, dragging 2 large, heavy black garbage bags behind her. She was wearing a plush cashmere sweater and expensive designer boots, looking every bit the pampered suburban princess. She hurled the bags down the pristine stone steps with all her strength. The thin plastic tore open against the concrete, spilling my faded nursing scrubs and cheap worn-out sneakers all over the frosted grass. Paige stood at the top of the stairs with her hands on her hips, breathing heavily. "Get off my property right now, Carmen!" She screamed the words so loudly they echoed down the quiet neighborhood street. "Mom and Dad just transferred the deed of this entire estate into my name this morning. You are nothing but a trespasser, and if you do not leave, I will call the police to have you dragged away in handcuffs." I did not flinch. I did not yell back. I looked down at the scattered scrubs lying in the freezing frost. Those faded clothes represented 10 years of working brutal double shifts in the intensive care unit. 10 years of missing meals so I could hand my paycheck over to Howard and Sylvia. 10 years of funding Paige's endless shopping sprees and luxury vacations. Kendrick finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He looked from me to his wife, and his eyes were wide with sudden, terrifying panic. He took a hasty step toward the stairs and reached out, trying to grab Paige's arm to silence her. He knew I was not lying about the federal fraud. He had seen the gold crest and felt the undeniable authority in my voice. But Paige violently shook his hand off. She was entirely too busy gloating to notice her husband sweating profusely in the freezing winter air. She lifted her chin and gave me a look of absolute disgust. She bragged that the house was her early inheritance. She claimed Howard and Sylvia had finally decided to cut the dead weight from the family tree. She said they wanted to ensure their true daughter and her highly successful tech billionaire husband had the perfect home to raise their future children. She told me to take my garbage and crawl back to whatever cheap motel I could afford on a nurse's salary. I walked over to the grass and calmly picked up a few of my belongings. I tossed the torn bags into the trunk of my 12-year-old Honda Civic and closed it with a soft, firm click. I turned back to face my sister. I kept my voice incredibly steady and calm. Did Howard and Sylvia happen to mention exactly how they paid for this $5 million estate, Paige? I asked the question evenly, letting the words hang in the cold morning air. Paige let out a harsh, grating laugh. With hard work and smart investments. Something a low-level bedpan cleaner like you would never understand. She crossed her arms and told me I was just jealous that I was being kicked out into the freezing cold where I truly belonged. I smiled at her. It was a cold, sharp smile that finally made her laughter die down. They bought this house using stolen trust funds, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the driveway. Specifically, they bought it using my trust funds. Every single brick of this mansion, every designer bag sitting in your massive closet, and every single dollar currently funding your husband's fake tech company was siphoned directly from my biological mother's estate. Paige rolled her eyes and groaned in theatrical annoyance. She called it a desperate, pathetic lie. She said I had finally lost my mind from working too many overnight shifts at the hospital. She demanded Kendrick step up and defend her from my crazy delusions. She wanted him to use his alpha male presence to intimidate me off the property. But Kendrick was completely silent. He stood frozen next to his midnight black Porsche, staring at me with sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew I was telling the truth. The federal loan he had fraudulently taken out using my identity was now tied directly to a massive, ongoing federal investigation involving the Vanderbilt estate. I looked right at Paige and delivered the final blow. The deed you are holding is entirely worthless, Paige. I explained that you cannot legally own property purchased with stolen money. The federal government calls it asset forfeiture. I told her she was currently standing on a massive federal crime scene. Paige refused to believe it. Her face flushed red with anger. She turned to Kendrick, expecting him to laugh with her, expecting him to mock me and order me off the property. Kendrick, tell her to get out of here, Paige demanded. Tell her she is crazy and call the police. Kendrick opened his mouth, but no words came out. His slick salesman persona had completely evaporated. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows, waiting for the lever to be pulled. His silence spoke volumes louder than any defense could have. I did not need to say anything else. The absolute silence from her arrogant husband was already planting the toxic seed of doubt in Paige's mind. I pulled my car keys from my pocket and walked toward the driver's side door. I did not need these old scrubs anyway. I was walking away from this life of poverty and abuse forever. I opened my car door and looked back at the two of them standing in the driveway. I suggest you go inside and start packing a bag, Paige, I said quietly. Because the real owners of this estate are coming to collect, and they do not knock politely. I climbed into my freezing Honda Civic and started the engine. I did not look back as I backed out of the long cobblestone driveway. I drove through the heavy iron gates and merged onto the main road, leaving the pristine suburban neighborhood behind me. As I drove away, my phone screen lit up brightly on the dashboard. It was an incoming urgent message from Dr. Gregory Pierce and his elite legal team. I safely pulled the car over to the shoulder of the road and opened the text message. My heart pounded against my ribs as I read the words. Action initiated. All of Howard and Sylvia's personal and business bank accounts have just been officially frozen by the federal court. The authorities are moving in. I locked my phone and shifted the car back into gear. I let out a long, slow breath. The reign of terror Howard and Sylvia had held over me for 2 decades was officially over. The countdown to their complete and total destruction had begun. For the first time in 10 years, I drove back to my tiny apartment without the heavy weight of my adoptive family dragging me down. The trap was set, and the financial freeze was fully in effect. I took a hot shower, threw my ruined scrubs in the trash, and slept for 12 solid hours. 2 days passed in complete silence. I knew the federal machine moved quietly until it was ready to strike. The first sign of their total collapse happened on a Thursday evening. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing my medical school application materials when my phone lit up with an unhinged voicemail from Kendrick. I pressed play, and his panicked, arrogant voice filled my small kitchen. He was breathing heavily and shouting over the loud background noise of a busy restaurant. He screamed that his exclusive black card had just been declined at the most expensive steakhouse in downtown Boston. He said he tried 3 different corporate accounts and every single one came back completely frozen. He accused me of hacking his banking portals out of pure jealousy. I smiled, picturing Kendrick sitting in a luxury leather booth sweating in his custom-tailored suit as the waiter handed back his useless plastic cards. His fake tech billionaire facade was cracking right in the middle of a crowded dining room, and he had absolutely no idea how deep the trouble really went. But panic makes desperate people do incredibly reckless things. By Friday morning, my phone was vibrating right off the kitchen counter. I had hundreds of notifications across every social media platform. Kendrick and Paige had realized their money was completely locked down, and they decided to go on a ruthless public offensive. They uploaded a highly edited, heavily scripted video to social media. I opened the app and watched the disaster unfold. Paige was sitting on the designer sofa in the suburban mansion, wearing no makeup to look appropriately distressed. She squeezed out fake tears while Kendrick sat next to her, looking solemn and deeply wronged. Paige looked right into the camera lens and delivered a masterclass in manipulation. She told millions of viewers that her mentally unstable and violently jealous older sister was trying to destroy their perfect family. She claimed I was a bitter nursing dropout who could not handle seeing my younger sister succeed. But the real venom came when she handed the floor to Kendrick. He looked directly at the camera and used his identity as a massive shield. He claimed I was intentionally weaponizing the legal system to ruin his successful black-owned tech business out of pure spite. He told the audience that I was a malicious racist trying to tear down a minority entrepreneur. He lied through his teeth, claiming I had stolen their passwords and was actively trying to illegally evict my own elderly parents from their forever home. The internet loves a victim, and Paige played the part flawlessly. The video went massively viral within a matter of hours. It hit the front page of every major social media platform. My inbox was completely flooded with absolute hatred. Strangers from all over the country were sending me vicious messages. They called me a monster. They sent graphic death threats demanding I return the money I supposedly stole from my elderly parents. They threatened to find my address and burn my car. Paige had successfully weaponized the public against me, twisting the story so completely that I was painted as a psychotic villain, attacking a thriving business and abusing helpless senior citizens. I turned off my notifications and put on my clean hospital scrubs. I was scheduled for a daytime shift in the intensive care unit, and I refused to let a viral internet lie stop me from doing my job. But the moment I walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospital, I could feel the immediate shift in the atmosphere. The security guards at the front desk gave me strange sideways glances. A group of nurses huddled near the elevator abruptly stopped talking and looked away as I approached. The viral video had clearly reached my workplace, and the judgment was thick in the sterile air. I kept my head held high and walked straight toward the locker room. Before I could even open the door, my pager beeped with an urgent, high-priority message from the director of nursing. I was ordered to report to the Human Resources Executive Suite immediately. I walked down the long white corridor and pushed open the heavy glass door of the main office, expecting to defend myself against the social media backlash. My nursing supervisor was standing behind her large mahogany desk, looking incredibly tense and deeply uncomfortable. But she was not alone. Sitting right across from her in the plush visitor chairs were my adoptive parents. Howard and Sylvia were both clutching crumpled tissues, putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime. Sylvia let out a loud, dramatic sob the exact second I walked into the room. She shrank back into her chair, pretending to be physically terrified of my presence. Howard jumped up from his seat, pointing a shaking, furious finger right at my face. He looked at my nursing supervisor and demanded that the hospital revoke my medical license immediately. He claimed I had stolen their life savings and formally accused me of severe elder abuse. He threw around the phrase elder abuse with aggressive and calculated repetition. In the American healthcare system, elder abuse is an immediate career-ending accusation. Any nurse facing that kind of severe allegation is instantly suspended, escorted off the premises, and heavily investigated by the state medical board. Howard knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to destroy the only independent livelihood I had ever known. He wanted to strip away the career I had spent 10 years building from the ground up. The director of nursing looked at me with deep concern and visible anxiety. She told me these were incredibly serious allegations that could not be ignored regardless of my flawless employment record. She explained that the hospital had a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding the ethical conduct of its intensive care unit nurses. She asked me if I had anything to say in my own defense before she contacted the legal department to initiate a formal suspension. Howard and Sylvia looked at me with triumphant venom in their eyes. They fully expected me to panic. They expected me to desperately try to explain myself, to cry, to beg for my job, to plead with my supervisor. They thought the terrifying threat of losing my nursing career would force me to completely surrender. They actually believed they could leverage my job to make me somehow reverse the federal freeze on their stolen bank accounts. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a single word of defense to my nursing supervisor. I simply turned around and opened the heavy glass door I had just walked through. I gave a swift, calm nod to the empty hallway. The head of hospital security walked right into the executive office, followed immediately by two uniformed Boston police officers. I had contacted them the exact moment I received the urgent high-priority page from Human Resources. After discovering the absolute depths of my adoptive family's deception with Dr. Gregory Pierce, I knew Howard and Sylvia would try a reckless and desperate stunt like this. I made absolutely sure the authorities were waiting right in the wing before I ever stepped foot into the room. The entire atmosphere in the executive suite violently shifted. Sylvia abruptly stopped her fake sobbing. Her mouth fell open and her carefully practiced tears instantly dried up as she stared at the heavy-duty belts and shiny badges of the police officers. Howard slowly lowered his pointing finger. The sudden imposing presence of actual law enforcement completely shattered their dramatic suburban performance. The commanding police officer stepped into the center of the room. He rested his hand on his utility belt and asked who had called for assistance regarding a major financial crime. I stepped forward, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my voice absolutely chilling and calm. I pulled a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope from my nursing bag. I pulled out a massive stack of certified bank statements and federal court documents that had been provided directly to me by the elite legal team at the medical school. I placed them squarely on the mahogany desk right in front of the police officers. Howard tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at the documents and all the color drained from his face. He instantly recognized the official seal of the federal court printed on the top page. I looked the lead police officer right in the eye and pointed a steady finger at my adoptive parents. I stated clearly and loudly that the two individuals sitting in the visitor chairs had fraudulently signed legal documents to establish a fake permanent guardianship over me when I was a child. I slid the highlighted bank statements across the smooth table surface. I told the officers that Howard and Sylvia had used a complex maze of shell corporations and fake routing numbers to systematically siphon $30,000 a month from my biological mother's estate. I explained that this calculated theft had been happening every single month for the past 25 years, resulting in millions of dollars in stolen assets. Sylvia began to hyperventilate, clutching the armrests of her leather chair so hard her knuckles turned white. Howard looked like he was about to pass out right on the carpet. His arrogant posture completely collapsed as the reality of the evidence stared him in the face. I looked down at Sylvia's pale, terrified face and delivered the final crushing blow. Officer, these two individuals have committed massive federal financial fraud and aggravated identity theft. I would like to formally press charges for grand larceny right now. The lead Boston police officer did not hesitate for a single second. He pulled out a small black notepad and formally advised Howard and Sylvia that they were now the subjects of an active and massive criminal investigation. The transformation in my adoptive mother was immediate and absolutely terrifying. Sylvia dropped the crumpled tissue from her chest. Her loud, theatrical sobbing stopped completely. The helpless victim facade vanished in the blink of an eye, and her face hardened into a mask of pure, selfish panic. She realized the police were not here to comfort her. They were here to build a grand larceny case against her. Howard tried to salvage his crumbling ego. He puffed out his chest and stepped toward me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into backing down. He told me I was going to regret crossing him, and that his high-powered lawyers would bury me in court. The second officer instantly put a firm hand on his service weapon and ordered Howard to step back. The officers informed them that if they did not leave the hospital premises immediately, they would be arrested right there in the executive suite for trespassing and creating a public disturbance. Howard and Sylvia were forced to turn around and walk out of the office in complete disgrace. They were flanked by the uniformed police officers and hospital security guards. They had to walk the long walk of shame through the main lobby, past all the doctors and nurses they had just tried to manipulate. My nursing supervisor sat frozen behind her desk, apologizing profusely to me for ever doubting my character. I just nodded, adjusted my badge, and walked back to the intensive care unit to finish my shift. While I was saving lives at the hospital, the stolen empire in the suburbs was rapidly imploding. Paige and Kendrick were discovering exactly what happens when the federal government cuts off the oxygen to a financial scam. Kendrick was standing in the grand foyer of the mansion, pacing back and forth on the imported marble floors. He was frantically trying to call his shady investors when the heavy, loud sound of a diesel tow truck engine rumbled up the cobblestone driveway, and to the large bay window, and let out a piercing scream. Two repo men in heavy work jackets were actively hooking thick metal chains to the axles of Kendrick's brand-new midnight black Porsche. Kendrick sprinted out the front door, shouting at the men to stop. He used his slick tech founder voice, trying to command authority and demanding they unhook his luxury vehicle. The lead repo man did not care about his tailored suit or his arrogant attitude. He simply shoved a thick, heavy clipboard right into Kendrick's chest. He bluntly explained that the federal banking system had flagged the purchase as highly fraudulent, and the dealership was repossessing the vehicle immediately. Paige stood on the front porch, shivering in her expensive cashmere sweater, hurling insults at the workers. She demanded Kendrick do something to fix this humiliating spectacle. She told him the neighbors were watching through their windows and their elite reputation was being completely destroyed. Kendrick ignored her. His smooth salesman persona was entirely gone. He watched his prized sports car get dragged down the driveway, and a profound, sickening realization washed over him. His stomach dropped as he turned around and rushed back inside the house. He ignored his wife and locked himself inside his lavish home office. He pulled down the window blinds and cracked open his laptop. His hands shook violently as he logged into his secure banking portals. He knew exactly how his fake tech company operated. He had no disruptive algorithms. He had no real product. He was running a textbook Ponzi scheme, using stolen money from Howard and Sylvia to pay off early investors while pocketing the rest to fund his luxury lifestyle. If the federal authorities were freezing my adoptive parents' accounts, it was only a matter of hours before the forensic accountants traced the stolen money directly into his startup ledgers. The United States government was going to uncover his massive fraud and tear his entire life apart. Kendrick could hear Paige screaming on her cell phone in the hallway. She was frantically calling Sylvia to complain about the repo men and demanding more cash to go shopping. She had absolutely no idea that her parents were currently fleeing from the police and facing decades in federal prison. Kendrick listened to his wife throwing her entitled tantrum and made a brutally cold and selfish calculation. He was not going to go down with this sinking ship. He was not going to spend the next 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for Howard and Sylvia. He did not care about family loyalty, and he certainly did not care about Paige. He opened a highly secure encrypted browser window. He had exactly $5 million left in a secondary investor account that had not been flagged by the authorities yet. He initiated an immediate massive wire transfer, routing every single penny through a complex web of untraceable offshore banks. Then he opened a new tab and navigated to an international airline website. He bypassed the economy options and clicked directly on the first-class section. Kendrick secretly booked a one-way ticket to Dubai, departing in less than 48 hours. He printed the boarding pass and folded it neatly into his jacket pocket. He planned to let his wife and her parents take the absolute full force of the federal indictment while he disappeared into the desert with millions of dollars of stolen cash. I sat in the secure conference room inside the university legal department staring at a massive digital monitor. David Caldwell, the senior legal counsel, stood next to a forensic accountant, tracking the movement of my stolen trust fund money. The high-tech software on the screen suddenly flared with a bright red alert flashing over a secondary banking portal. Kendrick was making a move. We watched in real time as he attempted to route exactly $5 million through a complex web of offshore accounts. David typed rapidly on his encrypted keyboard and pulled up an international flight registry. He pointed at the screen with a grim expression. Kendrick had just booked a one-way first-class ticket to Dubai, departing in less than 48 hours. He was abandoning ship. The moment his brand-new sports car was repossessed by the federal authorities, his fake tech billionaire facade shattered. I was planning to leave his wife Paige and my adoptive parents to take the absolute full force of the federal indictment while he vanished into the desert with millions of dollars in stolen cash. David explained the harsh legal reality of our situation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was actively building a rock-solid grand larceny and wire fraud case against my adoptive family. But federal warrants required absolute precision and time. If Kendrick boarded that international flight tomorrow, he could potentially slip through a jurisdiction loophole. He could tie up the legal process in international extradition courts for years, draining my mother's legacy in foreign legal fees. We needed him on American soil for just 2 more days. We needed him to willingly cancel that flight. Dr. Pierce paced across the thick carpet of the conference room. He asked how we could possibly stop a desperate criminal who was already packing his bags and running for his life. I looked at the flashing red screen and gave a cold, calculated smile. I told them we did not need to physically stop him. I knew Kendrick better than anyone in this room. He was not just a scammer, he was a textbook narcissist. His greatest weakness was not fear of prison. It was his massive, fragile ego and his desperate, unquenchable need to be recognized as an elite tech genius. I told Dr. Pierce we just needed to offer him a piece of bait so incredibly shiny and validating that his extreme greed would completely override his basic survival instinct. Dr. Pierce stopped pacing and understood my strategy immediately. He mentioned the annual Boston Medical Gala taking place this coming Saturday night. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society events in Massachusetts. Elite surgeons, billionaire hospital donors, and top-tier venture capitalists gathered there every single year. For the past 3 years, Paige and Kendrick had desperately tried to buy tickets just to post photos on social media and prove they belonged to the upper class. But their names were never approved by the strict guest list committee. I asked Dr. Pierce if he had any contacts at a high-profile venture capital firm who would be willing to make a very convincing phone call to a desperate man. Dr. Pierce gave a sharp, knowing smile. As the dean of the most prestigious medical school in the state, he commanded entire networks of wealthy alumni who owed him massive favors. Within 20 minutes, Dr. Pierce had a senior partner at an elite venture capital group on a secure conference call. We explained the exact parameters of the trap, and the executive agreed to play his part flawlessly. The venture capital partner picked up his private line and dialed Kendrick directly. We listened in dead silence on the speakerphone as the trap was sprung. Kendrick answered the phone breathless and clearly paranoid. He demanded to know who was calling. The partner used his smooth, incredibly professional voice. He introduced himself as the managing director of a massive technology investment fund. He claimed his firm had been quietly monitoring Kendrick and his startup company for months. He said his board of directors was incredibly impressed by his disruptive algorithms and visionary leadership. The partner did not hesitate. He offered Kendrick a massive $20 million Series A investment right on the spot. I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Kendrick was completely silent as his greedy mind violently clashed with his panic. He had literally been packing his suitcase to flee the country as a fugitive with a stolen $5 million. But now a highly respected firm was offering him $20 million completely legally. The partner did not give him time to overthink the situation. He pressed his advantage perfectly. He told Kendrick the investment board had unanimously approved the funding, but there was one strict, non-negotiable condition. The board wanted the new partnership to be highly publicized to boost their own portfolio. They required Kendrick to sign the official term sheet in person. Kendrick eagerly swallowed the bait. He asked where and when he needed to be to sign the documents. The partner delivered the ultimate hook. He told Kendrick the signing would take place live on stage at the Boston Medical Gala this Saturday night, in front of the most elite investors and medical pioneers in the city. He said the board wanted to officially welcome Kendrick into the absolute upper echelon of Boston high society. The silence on the line was thick with unbearable tension. Kendrick knew the federal authorities were freezing accounts left and right. He knew his luxury car had just been repossessed. He knew he had a guaranteed flight to Dubai waiting for him tomorrow morning. But the lure of the Boston Medical Gala was a drug he could not resist. The promise of $20 million and public elite validation completely blinded his rational thoughts. He would finally be the billionaire tech genius he had always pretended to be. He would finally prove to everyone that he was untouchable. Kendrick let his massive ego take the wheel. He pushed down his fear and told the venture capital partner he would be absolutely honored to attend the gala and sign the paperwork. He promised to be there in a custom tuxedo with his beautiful wife Paige right by his side. The call ended with professional pleasantries. David typed rapidly on his keyboard, monitoring the airline database in real time. A few agonizing minutes later, the screen refreshed. Kendrick had officially canceled his one-way first-class ticket to Dubai. The $5 million offshore wire transfer was paused as he decided he did not need to run as a fugitive anymore. He was going to stay and claim his throne. He had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. Dr. Pierce leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, heavy breath. He looked at me with deep respect and shook his head. He said Kendrick had absolutely no idea he was walking straight into a federal execution. I stared at the computer screen, watching the trap lock firmly into place. Kendrick thought he was going to be crowned the king of Boston high society. He thought he had outsmarted the federal government, my adoptive parents, and me. But he was completely oblivious to the fact that the contract waiting for him at that gala would be his permanent downfall. He had just voluntarily agreed to step onto a highly publicized, brightly lit stage where there would be absolutely nowhere left to hide. Back inside the sprawling suburban mansion, the atmosphere had shifted from sheer terror to absolute manic delusion. Kendrick slammed his laptop shut and let out a loud, triumphant shout that echoed off the marble walls of his home office. The paralyzing fear of federal prison had completely evaporated from his mind. It was entirely replaced by the blinding, intoxicating rush of his own massive ego. He ran out into the hallway and grabbed Paige by the shoulders. He spun her around and proudly announced that they were about to become actual billionaires. Paige looked at him with wide, confused eyes. She asked him about the repossessed sports car and the frozen bank accounts. Kendrick waved his hand dismissively. He used his slick, persuasive salesman voice to spin a brilliant web of lies. He convinced his wife that the frozen funds were nothing but a temporary bureaucratic glitch caused by my jealous, petty complaints. He told her a massive top-tier venture capital firm had been secretly tracking his genius algorithms for months. He bragged that they were offering him a $20 million contract and demanding he sign it live on stage at the highly exclusive Boston Medical Gala this Saturday night. Paige gasped in sheer delight. The fear of eviction vanished instantly from her shallow mind. Sylvia, who had been listening from the top of the stairs, hurried down to join the celebration. The two women completely ignored the massive red flags surrounding their financial collapse. They only cared about one thing. They were finally going to attend the most elite high society event in the city, and they were going to be the guests of honor. Sylvia loudly declared that they needed to show up to the gala looking like absolute royalty just to rub their untouchable wealth in my face. But there was a massive, glaring problem. Every single one of their primary bank accounts and platinum credit cards was still locked down tight by the federal court order. They had absolutely no liquid cash. A rational person would have stayed home and contacted a defense attorney, but greed and vanity are a highly toxic combination. Sylvia was so desperate to maintain her wealthy suburban facade that she resorted to extreme financial recklessness. She went online and applied for several predatory high-interest credit cards. She willingly accepted brutal 30% interest rates just to get access to immediate spending power. Armed with this highly toxic debt, Paige and Sylvia marched straight down to the most expensive luxury boutiques in the city. They acted like they owned the world. They demanded the absolute highest level of customer service from the exhausted retail workers. Paige purchased a heavily beaded custom designer gown that cost more than a reliable used car. She insisted on buying matching designer heels that pinched her feet just because of the brand name printed on the sole. Sylvia bought a dark velvet dress and rented tens of thousands of dollars worth of diamond jewelry using the new predatory credit lines as collateral. They swiped the cards with reckless abandon, completely oblivious to the fact that they were digging their own financial graves even deeper. They wanted to look perfect when they destroyed me in public. Kendrick was equally trapped in his own grandiose delusions. Since his brand new sports car had been repossessed, he refused to arrive at the medical gala in a standard vehicle. He used the last of his remaining credit limits to rent an absurdly expensive stretch limousine for the evening. He wanted to pull up to the red carpet and step out under the flashing lights of the press cameras like a certified technology mogul. He spent hours pacing back and forth in his home office, practicing his acceptance speech in the mirror. He practiced looking humble but brilliant. He practiced thanking his imaginary investors and plotting exactly how he would casually mention his $20 million valuation to every single doctor and surgeon in the room. He truly believed he was about to conquer the world and leave me in the dust forever. While my adoptive family was drowning themselves in fake luxury and toxic debt, I was preparing for absolute war. I was not pacing around a mansion or maxing out credit cards to buy an overpriced dress. I was standing quietly inside a private dressing room at a highly exclusive bespoke tailor shop in downtown Boston. Dr. Gregory Pierce had personally recommended the master tailor for a very specific and delicate task. I stood in front of a full-length mirror and looked at my reflection. I was not wearing a rented diamond necklace or an uncomfortable beaded gown. I was wearing the exact same navy blue blazer that Paige had ruined with industrial bleach just a few days ago. The massive, jagged white stains still dominated the entire left side of the jacket. I refused to let the tailor cover it up or fix the damaged wool. The bleach stain was a permanent badge of honor. It was the physical proof of their cruelty and the exact catalyst that had finally set me free. But the inside of the jacket had undergone a spectacular transformation. The master tailor had carefully worked on the exposed panel of vintage silk where the bleach had eaten through the top layer of the garment. He had taken the faded, intricate Vanderbilt crest and meticulously restored it using actual solid gold threading. The intertwined letter Vi and the surrounding oak leaves now caught the light and shimmered with an undeniable brilliant authority. The gold threading stood out perfectly against the stark white background of the ruined fabric. It was a beautiful, terrifying contrast. It was the perfect visual representation of exactly what I was about to do to them. They had tried to bleach away my future and destroy my confidence. Instead, they had completely exposed the unbreakable golden legacy of my biological mother. I ran my fingers over the raised gold stitching of the crest. I felt the heavy weight of the Vanderbilt name settling onto my shoulders. I did not feel like a terrified, exhausted intensive care unit nurse anymore. I felt like a woman holding the executioner's sword. I buttoned the blazer and adjusted my collar, making sure the gold emblem was perfectly visible. Kendrick thought he was walking onto a stage to be crowned a billionaire tech genius. Paige thought she was going to be the absolute center of high society attention. Sylvia and Howard thought they had successfully buried my identity forever and secured their stolen wealth. I looked right into my own eyes in the mirror and gave a slow, cold smile. The trap was perfectly set and the bait had been swallowed whole. Tonight, the bright flashing lights of the Boston Medical Gala would illuminate every single one of their lies. I was ready to walk into that ballroom and tear their entire stolen empire straight to the ground. The annual Boston Medical Gala was a spectacle of absolute opulence. It was held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown hotel. Thousands of crystal prisms refracted the light from massive chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white coats carried silver trays loaded with champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. This was the pinnacle of Massachusetts high society. Billionaire hospital donors, elite surgeons, and top-tier venture capitalists filled the room. I walked through the heavy gilded doors and felt the immediate weight of the room shift. I was not wearing a rented beaded gown. I was wearing my navy blue blazer. The massive white bleach craters still dominated the left side of the fabric, but the exposed vintage silk panel caught the chandelier light perfectly. The newly restored solid gold threading of the Vanderbilt crest gleamed with undeniable authority. A few older surgeons and wealthy donors recognized the crest immediately. They stepped aside and gave me respectful, curious nods. I was no longer an invisible nurse. I was a sovereign stepping into her kingdom. Before the main presentation began, I slipped away from the crowded ballroom and stepped into the women's powder room. It was an expansive space lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors and imported Italian marble. I needed a moment of absolute silence to center my mind before the trap officially closed. I walked up to the gold-plated sink and turned on the warm water. The heavy wooden door suddenly swung open with a violent thud. Paige marched into the room. She was wearing a heavily beaded designer gown that looked painfully tight and restricted her breathing. Her neck and wrists were draped in rented diamond jewelry that sparkled aggressively under the vanity lights. She had clearly maxed out those predatory high-interest credit cards just to create this desperate illusion of extreme wealth. She stopped dead in her tracks the exact second she saw my reflection in the mirror. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, arrogant disgust. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed off the marble walls. "You actually wore that trash to a high society event?" She spat the words out like venom. "You are absolutely pathetic, Carmen." She walked closer, her rented heels clicking loudly on the stone floor. She completely ignored the intricate gold embroidery shining on my chest. Her shallow mind only saw the jagged white bleach stain. She told me I looked like a homeless person who had wandered into the wrong building. She crossed her arms and lifted her chin, looking down at me with supreme entitlement. She bragged that she and her husband were the absolute guests of honor tonight. She claimed Kendrick was out there rubbing elbows with the most powerful investors in the country. "We own this city tonight, Carmen." She boasted, her voice dripping with toxic arrogance. "Kendrick is signing a $20 million deal in front of everyone. We are going to be certified billionaires, and you are still just a bitter broke dropout trying to ruin our happiness because you are jealous." I did not raise my voice. I did not turn around to face her. I kept my eyes locked directly onto her reflection in the mirror. I slowly pumped soap into my hands and washed them methodically under the warm water. My absolute silence seemed to infuriate her even more. She demanded that I turn around and look at her. She demanded that I acknowledge her superior status. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on a thick linen towel. I finally turned around and leaned casually against the marble counter. I looked at the heavy rented diamonds cutting into her neck. I looked at the panic and desperation hiding just beneath her thick layer of expensive makeup. "A $20 million deal," I asked, my voice chillingly calm and steady. "I really hope your husband reads the fine print, Paige, because when the check comes due tonight, nobody is going to bail you out." Paige let out another harsh, grating laugh, but her hands were trembling slightly. She told me I was delusional. She claimed the venture capital firm had practically begged Kendrick to take their money because his algorithms were so revolutionary. She said the frozen bank accounts and the repossessed sports car were just minor bumps in the road. She bragged that tomorrow morning they would buy a brand new mansion in cash and leave Howard and Sylvia to deal with the federal mess alone. She openly admitted she did not care if her own parents went to prison as long as she got her millions. I gave her a slow, icy smile. I told her she was wearing a very expensive gown for a woman whose entire life was currently built on federal wire fraud and stolen identity. I stepped closer, dropping my voice into a low, dangerous tone. I told her that real power does not need to rent jewelry at 30% interest. Real power does not need to beg for entry into a ballroom. I tapped a manicured finger directly onto the solid gold Vanderbilt crest sitting on my chest. I told her the money she and her fake tech bro husband were chasing was nothing but a brilliant, deadly illusion. I explained that she was standing on a trapdoor and the lever had already been pulled. Paige's face flushed a deep, angry red. She opened her mouth to scream another insult at me, but a sharp, violent buzzing sound cut her off. Her diamond-encrusted clutch vibrated loudly against the marble counter. She snatched it up and pulled out her phone. Her eyes scanned the bright screen, and her arrogant smirk immediately returned. She shoved the phone back into her purse and stood up perfectly straight. "It is Kendrick," she announced proudly. "He told me to hurry up and get out to the main ballroom. The venture capital representatives are ready for him. He is about to take the stage to be officially recognized as a pioneering tech innovator. He is signing the contract right now." Paige grabbed the heavy door handle. She looked back at me with absolute toxic triumph. She told me that the exact second the ink dried on that $20 million contract, she was going to have hotel security drag me out of the building by my hair. She promised to ruin my nursing career and sue me for every penny I had left. I did not flinch. I did not try to stop her. I simply stepped aside and extended my hand toward the exit. I smiled and told her she better hurry, because she definitely did not want to miss a single second of her husband's big moment on stage. Paige threw her head back and marched out of the powder room, her heavy beaded gown sweeping across the floor. I waited a few seconds, listening to her heels click rapidly down the hallway. I took one last look in the mirror, adjusting the lapel of my bleached blazer. The gold Vanderbilt crest gleamed back at me. It was time to watch their entire stolen empire burn to ashes. I pulled open the heavy wooden door and followed her straight into the grand ballroom. I stepped out of the marble hallway and walked through the heavy gilded doors of the grand ballroom. The sheer scale of the event was staggering. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over hundreds of Boston's most elite citizens. Top-tier surgeons, billionaire hospital donors, and high-powered venture capitalists sat at circular tables draped in pristine white linen. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. It was a room entirely built on wealth, power, and reputation. I did not walk toward the front. I stayed near the back of the room, leaning casually against a thick marble pillar. I adjusted the lapel of my bleached navy blazer, making sure the gold Vanderbilt crest was sitting perfectly flat against my chest. From my vantage point, I had an unobstructed view of the main stage and the people sitting directly in front of it. Howard and Sylvia were seated at the absolute center of the front row. They looked like two incredibly smug monarchs presiding over their kingdom. Sylvia was wearing the dark velvet dress she had bought on a predatory high-interest credit card. Her neck was draped in rented diamond jewelry that sparkled aggressively under the stage lights. She sat with her posture perfectly rigid, radiating a toxic sense of superiority. Howard sat next to her wearing a rented tuxedo that was slightly too tight across his shoulders. He was loudly chatting with a wealthy hospital donor at the next table, laughing and acting like he was an integral part of the Boston billionaire class. Paige hurried down the center aisle and took the empty seat next to our adoptive parents. Her heavy beaded gown swept across the carpet. She leaned over and whispered something into Sylvia's ear. Both women turned around in their seats and scanned the back of the ballroom. When their eyes finally found me standing by the pillar, they exchanged a look of absolute wicked triumph. They truly believed I was about to be publicly humiliated and dragged out by security. I simply raised my glass of sparkling water and gave them a slow, icy smile. The lights in the ballroom gently dimmed, signaling the start of the main presentation. A hushed, expectant silence fell over the wealthy crowd. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the acrylic podium on the stage. He spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing clearly across the massive room. He announced that tonight the medical community was not just celebrating surgical innovations, but also welcoming a brilliant new mind into the fold of top-tier medical technology. He introduced Kendrick as a pioneering tech innovator. He called him a visionary who was about to revolutionize the way healthcare data was processed across the globe. The heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage parted. Kendrick strutted out into the bright spotlight. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo with a silk lapel. He walked with a slow, calculated swagger, completely soaking in the roaring applause from the elite crowd. He unbuttoned his jacket and took his place at the center microphone. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors and brilliant doctors with an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. I truly believed he had conquered the world. Kendrick gripped the sides of the podium and leaned forward. He started his speech with a smooth, practiced charm. He thanked the board of directors for recognizing his unparalleled genius. He spun a brilliant, complex web of absolute lies. He talked about spending countless sleepless nights coding his disruptive algorithms. He used all his favorite meaningless buzzwords talking about market synergy, paradigm shifts, and vertical integration. He spoke with such intense fake passion that some of the older investors in the crowd were actually nodding along in agreement. Then his tone shifted. His voice dropped into a register of fake humility. He told the audience that building a billion-dollar empire from the ground up was never an easy journey. He said that true innovators always face massive obstacles. He looked directly at the front row, making eye contact with Paige, Sylvia, and Howard. I want to take a moment to acknowledge my beautiful wife and my incredibly supportive in-laws, Kendrick said, his voice echoing through the speakers. They stood by me when malicious, jealous people tried to tear this company down. They protected my vision when toxic individuals tried to drain our resources and sabotage our success. It takes true strength to cut dead weight out of your life so you can finally soar. Howard and Sylvia beamed with stolen pride. Paige dabbed at her dry eyes, pretending to be overwhelmed by the emotional tribute. It was a masterful, deeply insulting jab aimed directly at me. Kendrick was using his platform to publicly label me as a jealous hater who had tried to ruin his fake empire. He was rewriting history in front of hundreds of people, painting himself as a heroic survivor of my supposed abuse. The crowd offered a warm, sympathetic round of applause. Kendrick soaked it up, closing his eyes and nodding his head like a modern-day martyr. When the applause died down, a representative from the venture capital firm walked onto the stage. He was an older, distinguished man in a sharp gray suit. He was a senior member of Dr. Gregory Pierce's wealthy alumni network, and he was playing his role flawlessly. He walked up to the podium carrying a thick, heavy, leather-bound portfolio. He placed it squarely in front of Kendrick and opened it to the final page. This was the moment. This was the $20 million contract Kendrick had canceled his flight to Dubai to sign. Kendrick let out a loud, dramatic sigh of victory. He turned to the audience and gave one last arrogant, incredibly smug smile. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He held the pen up, allowing the stage lights to catch the shiny metal. He wanted everyone in the room to witness the exact second he officially became a billionaire. He leaned over the podium. He positioned his hand over the thick, high-quality paper inside the leather binder. He lowered the gold pen. The tip of the pen hovered just 1 millimeter above the signature line. Before the ink could even touch the page, a loud, violent popping sound erupted from the massive speakers. The microphone at the podium instantly went dead, cutting off Kendrick's heavy breathing. Then every single crystal chandelier in the grand ballroom shut off at the exact same time. The stage lights died. The wall sconces went black. The entire massive room was instantly plunged into total absolute darkness. The sudden pitch blackness caused an immediate wave of confusion to ripple through the crowded ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy guests murmured in surprise. The loud popping sound from the blown speakers still echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. I stood perfectly still near the back marble pillar, watching the chaos unfold. Kendrick was completely frozen on the dark stage. The heavy gold-plated pen was still gripped tightly in his trembling hand. He could not see anything, but I knew his massive, fragile ego was panicking. He thought a simple power outage was ruining the greatest moment of his entire life. In the front row, I could hear Sylvia letting out a sharp, annoyed gasp, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about the terrible hotel management ruining her son-in-law's billionaire coronation. The darkness only lasted for exactly 10 agonizing seconds. Then a blinding, piercing white light suddenly sliced through the pitch-black room. The massive floor-to-ceiling projector screen positioned directly behind the main stage roared to life. The high-definition display was so incredibly bright, it illuminated the entire front half of the ballroom, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare right onto Kendrick's sweating face. The elite crowd immediately fell dead silent. They all turned their attention to the massive screen, expecting to see a sleek, modern logo for a revolutionary new tech company. They expected to see disruptive algorithms and visionary branding from the man who had just bragged about building an empire from the ground up. Instead, what flashed across the towering screen was a highly detailed, undeniably authentic financial flowchart. The text was massive and impossible to ignore. At the very top of the screen, the official seal of the United States federal government was prominently displayed next to a Small Business Administration loan approval form. The loan amount was written in bold, thick red letters totaling exactly $500,000. The flowchart used bright red arrows to track the exact movement of that massive sum of money. The arrows pointed directly from my full legal name and my personal social security number straight into a private personal checking account. The screen clearly displayed Kendrick's full name as the sole owner of that receiving account. To make the absolute devastation even clearer, the flowchart broke down his immediate spending. It showed a direct cash transfer from that stolen federal money straight to a luxury car dealership for the exact purchase price of his midnight black sports car. The wealthy venture capitalists and elite surgeons sitting in the audience were not fools. They analyzed complex financial portfolios every single day for a living. A collective sharp gasp echoed across the ballroom as hundreds of powerful people simultaneously realized exactly what they were looking at. It was not a pitch deck for a visionary startup. It was a perfectly documented step-by-step confession of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Kendrick slowly turned his head to look at the massive screen behind him. His jaw dropped open. The gold pen slipped from his sweaty fingers and hit the wooden stage floor with a hollow thud that echoed into the silent room. He stumbled backward, gripping the clear acrylic podium to keep his legs from collapsing underneath him. He looked out at the venture capital representative who was standing next to him on the stage. The older, distinguished man slowly backed away from Kendrick, pulling his suit jacket tightly around himself, as if the self-proclaimed tech genius was suddenly highly contagious. But the digital presentation was not over yet. The massive screen smoothly split cleanly down the middle. A second highly detailed document appeared right next to Kendrick's federal fraud flowchart. This new document was a 25-year continuous financial ledger. At the very top, in elegant bold lettering, it read, "The Elise Vanderbilt Trust Fund." A low, shocked murmur swept through the older hospital donors in the room, who instantly recognized the legendary Vanderbilt name. The screen automatically zoomed in on a specific section of the trust fund stipulations. It highlighted the mandatory $30,000 monthly living stipends that were legally designated exclusively for the care of the missing heir. A new set of bright red arrows appeared on the screen, tracking decades of stolen wealth. The arrows traced the $30,000 monthly payments flowing directly out of the Vanderbilt estate and routing through a complex, shady maze of fake shell corporations. The final destination of every single stolen dollar was displayed in massive, undeniable text. It was a joint bank account owned exclusively by Howard and Sylvia. The screen displayed the total amount of money they had systematically siphoned over the past 25 years, totaling millions upon millions of stolen dollars. In the front row, Sylvia let out a loud, terrified shriek. She threw her hands over her face, trying to hide from the blinding light of the projector screen shining down on her rented diamonds. Howard physically recoiled in his chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked around wildly at the billionaire donors and elite surgeons sitting at the tables right next to him. The wealthy socialites who had just been laughing and drinking champagne with him were now staring at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Paige sat completely frozen between her parents, clutching her heavy beaded gown as the horrific reality of their complete financial and social destruction washed over her. The moment the crowd fully absorbed the sheer magnitude of the crimes displayed on the screen, the ballroom chandeliers suddenly snapped back on with a blinding flash. The room was flooded with bright, warm light again, but the atmosphere was entirely different. It was heavy with toxic tension and unspoken intense judgment. I stepped away from the marble pillar at the back of the room. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Every single eye in the room tracked my movement. I walked past the tables of stunned investors and shocked medical professionals until I reached the very front of the room, just below the elevated stage. I stepped up to the floor-level microphone that had been set up for audience questions. I stood there under the bright lights, holding a small black presentation clicker in my right hand. I looked up at Kendrick, who was trembling uncontrollably behind the podium, and then I looked down at Howard, Sylvia, and Paige cowering in the front row. I adjusted the collar of my navy blue blazer, making absolutely sure the solid gold Vanderbilt crest was gleaming under the chandeliers. The entire ballroom of elites stares in dead silence. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom felt like a physical weight pressing down on every single person in the room. I stood at the floor microphone at the front of the center aisle, holding the small presentation clicker in my hand. The massive screen behind the stage continued to glow brightly, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the podium. Kendrick was gripping the acrylic edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, and his survival instinct finally kicked in. He tried to rely on the only weapon he had left, which was his slick salesman charm. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded incredibly hollow and desperate in the quiet room. He tapped the dead microphone in front of him a few times, and then raised his voice to project across the tables without amplification. He told the wealthy audience not to panic. He waved his hand dismissively at the massive federal fraud flowchart glowing right behind his head. He claimed this was nothing but a pathetic technical glitch. He plastered on a fake smile and told the elite crowd that his company was currently dealing with a highly unstable, disgruntled former associate who was trying to pull a jealous prank. He actually pointed a shaking finger down at me standing in the aisle. I told the billionaire hospital donors that I was a bitter, unhinged nurse who simply could not handle seeing her brother-in-law succeed. He turned to the distinguished venture capital representative who was standing near the edge of the stage. Kendrick aggressively demanded that the man call hotel security immediately to have me arrested for trespassing and corporate sabotage. He shouted that he was a highly respected tech innovator and that this prestigious event was being ruined by a psychotic individual. The representative did not reach for his phone. He did not call for security. He simply looked at Kendrick with a cold expression of absolute professional disgust. He buttoned his suit jacket, turned around, and casually walked down the side stairs of the stage, leaving Kendrick completely and utterly alone under the bright spotlight. I pressed the button on my microphone. The sound system had been entirely rewired to isolate my channel. When I spoke, my voice boomed through the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom, perfectly clear and chillingly calm. There is no glitch, Kendrick. I said the words slowly, letting them echo off the marble walls. I did not yell. I used the exact same steady, authoritative tone I used when directing a medical code in the intensive care unit. And this is definitely not a prank. Kendrick stared down at me, his chest heaving. Sweat was visibly pouring down his forehead, ruining his custom-tailored tuxedo collar. He slammed his hand against the leather-bound portfolio sitting on the podium. He shouted that I was crazy. He screamed to the room that he had just secured a massive $20 million investment and that no amount of fake slideshows could stop his company from going public. He proudly declared that his signature was already on the contract and the deal was legally binding. I looked up at him and gave a slow, icy smile. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. His signature was officially on the document and it was entirely legally binding. But there is no $20 million investment, Kendrick. I said, my voice slicing through his arrogant delusion. I explained that the venture capital firm he had been speaking to did not actually exist. The managing director who called him with that massive offer was not looking to fund his disruptive algorithms. He did not care about market synergy or vertical integration. I told him the man on the phone was a senior member of Dr. Gregory Pierce's elite alumni network, helping me set a trap for a desperate fleeing criminal. I told Kendrick we tracked his offshore wire transfers and his canceled first-class ticket to Dubai. We knew exactly how desperate he was to steal the last $5 million of investor money before the authorities closed in on his Ponzi scheme. Kendrick's eyes darted frantically around the room. He looked down at the heavy leather-bound portfolio sitting on the podium. His hands trembled violently as he grabbed the edge of the thick paper he had just proudly signed with his gold-plated pen. I did not let him read it in silence. I announced the truth to the entire ballroom, ensuring that every single powerful person in the room understood the exact nature of his crimes. The contract you just signed is not a term sheet, Kendrick. I said, projecting my voice so every single billionaire donor and elite surgeon could hear the absolute devastation of his fake empire. It is an official acknowledgement of receipt for a federal subpoena. You just legally confirmed your true identity and your physical presence for the United States government. The collective gasp from the elite audience was instantaneous. Kendrick stared at the paper in his hands. He read the bold federal lettering at the top of the document. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, cornered animal. He had voluntarily stayed in the country, canceled his flight to Dubai, and walked onto a highly publicized stage just to hand-deliver his own federal confession. I turned my attention away from the crumbling fake tech bro on the stage and looked directly at the front row. Howard and Sylvia were physically shrinking into their chairs. Sylvia was hyperventilating, clutching her rented diamond necklace as if it could somehow protect her from the law. Paige sat frozen, staring at her husband on the stage with wide, horrified eyes. I looked right into my adoptive mother's panicked face. "You told me I was a disappointment, Sylvia," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable power. "You told me I was a charity case who owed you everything. You threw me out into the freezing winter night because I refused to be a guarantor for his fraudulent loans. But you built this entire fake life using my biological mother's legacy. You sat in the front row tonight wearing diamonds bought with predatory credit because you thought my $30,000 a month would always be there to bail you out. You thought you could keep me exhausted and poor forever while you lived like absolute royalty on stolen money." Paige finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She jumped up from her chair, her heavy beaded gown rustling loudly. She pointed at me and screamed that I was lying. She yelled that they owned a massive suburban mansion and that I was just a jealous broke nurse trying to ruin their perfect family. I looked at my younger sister with pure cold pity. "You do not own anything, Paige," I stated firmly. "The deed to that mansion is worthless because it was purchased with stolen trust funds. The luxury car your husband bought was repossessed yesterday by the federal banking authorities, and the expensive dress you are wearing right now is funded by toxic debt you can never repay. You are completely and utterly bankrupt." Howard tried to stand up, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He opened his mouth to shout another threat at me, but he never got the chance to speak a single word. At the exact back of the grand ballroom, the heavy gilded double doors suddenly burst completely open with a violent, resounding crash. The sound made every single wealthy guest in the room jump in their seats. The crystal prisms on the chandeliers shook from the force of the doors hitting the marble walls. A team of men and women dressed in tactical dark windbreakers marched straight through the entrance. They moved with absolute terrifying military precision. Printed in bold, bright yellow letters across the back of their jackets were two distinct acronyms that struck pure fear into the hearts of white-collar criminals everywhere: FBI and SEC. The federal authorities had officially arrived and they were marching straight down the center aisle of the ballroom directly toward the stage. The heavy gilded double doors of the grand ballroom had just slammed against the marble walls with a deafening crash. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the letters FBI and SEC printed in bright yellow marched straight down the center aisle. The synchronized sound of their heavy boots hitting the polished floor echoed through the silent room. Wealthy hospital donors and high-powered venture capitalists immediately scrambled out of their way. No one dared to speak a single word. The atmosphere shifted from a high society gala to an active federal crime scene in a matter of seconds. I stood near the front row watching the absolute destruction of my adoptive family unfold perfectly. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. For 10 years they had treated me like garbage. Now they were tearing each other apart like rats on a sinking ship. On the stage, Kendrick was completely frozen. He stared at the approaching federal agents with wide, terrified eyes. His expensive custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The heavy gold-plated pen he had dropped earlier lay forgotten on the wooden floor. He looked frantically at the side exits, but uniformed police officers were already securing every single door in the massive ballroom. There was absolutely nowhere left to hide. His fake tech billionaire empire was crashing down around him in real time. When the lead FBI agent reached the bottom of the stage steps, Kendrick completely snapped. The smooth, arrogant salesman who had just bragged about overcoming his jealous haters completely vanished. In his place was a desperate, cowardly fraud. He lunged forward and grabbed the center microphone with both trembling hands. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not remain silent. His fragile ego shattered and he immediately went into pure selfish preservation mode. He screamed into the microphone. His voice cracked with sheer panic echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He shouted that he was innocent. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the front row where his wife was sitting. He screamed that it was all Paige. He yelled to the federal agents and the entire room that she was the one who made him do it. He claimed she was obsessed with maintaining a luxury lifestyle and forced him to find a way to fund it. The crowd of elites gasped in absolute shock. But Kendrick did not stop there. He shifted his pointing finger from his wife to my adoptive parents. He shouted into the microphone that Howard and Sylvia were the actual masterminds. He told the entire room of billionaires that they had been stealing $30,000 a month for 25 years. He screamed that they were the ones who gave him the idea to use my social security number to secure the federal business loan. He loudly declared that he was just a clueless front man and that his wealthy in-laws had maliciously manipulated him into running the fake tech company. Paige sat in the front row, completely paralyzed. The heavy rented diamond necklace sparkled against her skin as she stared up at her husband in absolute horror. The man she had relentlessly bragged about, the man who was supposed to buy her a new mansion tomorrow morning, had just thrown her entirely to the wolves in front of hundreds of people. Her face crumpled. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. The arrogant suburban princess realized she was nothing but a human shield for a selfish coward. Howard realized the situation was entirely hopeless. He heard his son-in-law confessing to federal crimes on a live microphone and decided to save his own skin. He did not try to defend his daughter. He did not even look at his wife Sylvia, who was currently hyperventilating in her chair. He quietly stood up from his seat in the front row and tried to slip away. He kept his head down and scurried toward a dimly lit side exit near the kitchen doors. I thought the federal agents were too focused on the screaming man on the stage to notice an older man slipping away into the shadows. But the federal authorities do not leave blind spots. Just as Howard reached his hand out to push the side exit door open, two tall SEC agents stepped out from the shadows. They stood shoulder to shoulder, completely blocking his path. One of the agents crossed his arms and looked at Howard with a cold, hard stare. He told my adoptive father to turn right back around and take his seat. Howard physically deflated. His broad shoulders slumped and his face turned a sickly pale gray. He slowly turned around and walked back to the front row, a completely defeated and broken man. The lead FBI agent calmly walked up the wooden stairs of the stage. He did not yell. He did not rush. He moved with the undeniable authority of the United States government. He walked right up to the podium and firmly ripped the microphone out of Kendrick's sweating hands. Kendrick immediately raised both of his hands in the air, completely surrendering. His knees shook so violently he could barely stand upright under the bright stage lights. The FBI agent looked Kendrick right in the eye. He spoke in a loud, clear voice that carried perfectly across the silent ballroom. He stated Kendrick's full legal name and told him he was officially under arrest for federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The agent recited the Miranda rights, flawlessly detailing the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. As he spoke, he grabbed Kendrick by the arms and spun him around to face the massive projector screen that was still displaying his detailed financial crimes. The sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around the wrists of the fake billionaire tech founder echoed sharply across the room. I stood in the center aisle watching him being dragged away. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I turned my attention back to the front row where the true architects of my misery were finally facing their own absolute destruction. Howard was currently pinned against the mahogany wainscoting near the kitchen exit. The two Securities and Exchange Commission agents had him securely boxed in. Howard was sweating profusely, desperately trying to negotiate with federal agents as if they were local country club members he could bribe. They simply read him his rights and placed him in zip ties, holding him for the transport vans waiting outside the hotel. But it was Sylvia who provided the most pathetic display of the entire evening. She sat in her front row chair, hyperventilating as she watched her husband get detained. She looked at the massive projector screen, which was still brightly displaying the 25-year financial ledger of her stolen wealth. She looked out at the sea of wealthy Boston elites who were staring at her with absolute unfiltered disgust. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. Her pristine suburban reputation was completely dead. The country club memberships, the luxury vacations, the fake charity dinners, all of it was gone forever. She was about to trade her velvet designer gowns for a federal prison jumpsuit. In a state of sheer blind panic, Sylvia decided she had one final desperate card left to play. She scrambled out of her chair, her heavy velvet dress getting tangled around her ankles. She practically ran down the center aisle, pushing past a stunned venture capitalist to get to me. She threw away every single ounce of her carefully crafted dignity. Right there in the middle of the grand ballroom in front of the most powerful people in Massachusetts, my adoptive mother dropped heavily onto both of her knees. She landed right at my feet on the thick carpet. The heavy rented diamond necklace swung violently around her neck as she looked up at me. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive professional makeup. She reached out with her trembling hands and tried to grab the hem of my trousers. I took a sharp step backward, completely disgusted by her touch. "Carmen, please!" Sylvia wailed, her voice shrill and echoing with hysterical desperation. "You have to stop this. Tell them it is a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we had a verbal agreement about the trust fund. You cannot let them take us away. We are your family. We raised you." I looked down at the woman who had spent 2 decades making me feel like a worthless burden. I remembered the nights I went to bed hungry because she claimed groceries were too expensive. I remembered the way she mocked my nursing career, telling her friends I was just a glorified maid cleaning up after sick people. I remembered the freezing night just a few days ago when she watched Howard throw me out into the snow because I refused to sign a fraudulent federal loan document for her criminal son-in-law. "We gave you a roof over your head." Sylvia continued to sob, clasping her hands together in a pathetic begging motion. "We took you in when you had absolutely nothing. You were an orphan, Carmen. We fed you and clothed you and gave you a respected name. You owe us. Please just tell the agents you authorized the monthly transfers." I stood perfectly still, letting her pathetic pleas echo into the silent room. I looked down at her and my voice was chillingly calm. It cut through her fake tears like a scalpel. "You did not raise me, Sylvia," I said, ensuring my words projected clearly across the entire ballroom. "You held me hostage." Sylvia flinched as if I had physically struck her. "You never legally adopted me." I continued, my voice unwavering and filled with undeniable authority. "You manipulated the court system to establish a fraudulent guardianship so you could steal my biological mother's legacy. You took $30,000 every single month for 25 years. You used my money to buy your mansion, to buy your cars, and to fund Paige's entire existence. You treated me like a stray dog because you needed to break my spirit, so I would never find the strength to ask where the money was coming from. But I was a good mother." Sylvia cried desperately, clutching her chest. "I loved you like my own. You loved the check that came with my name on it." I corrected her coldly. "The only thing you ever actually gave me was a lifetime of psychological abuse and this cheap wool blazer." I deliberately unbuttoned the top of my jacket and pulled the lapel back. The bright stage lights caught the exposed vintage silk panel. The newly restored solid gold Vanderbilt crest gleamed brightly right in Sylvia's terrified face. "Your golden child poured industrial bleach on my only professional piece of clothing because she wanted to ruin my medical school interview," I told the weeping woman at my feet. "She thought she was destroying my future, but all she did was burn away the cheap facade you forced me to wear." She exposed the truth. "And I wore this exact bleached jacket tonight for one reason only. I wore it just to watch you fall." Sylvia stared at the golden crest. The last tiny flicker of hope completely died in her eyes. She let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure defeat and collapsed forward onto the carpet, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. 2 female FBI agents stepped forward from the aisle. They grabbed Sylvia by her arms, pulled her up from the floor, and briskly escorted her toward the lobby to join her husband in federal custody. I turned my gaze away from my adoptive mother and looked directly at the front row. Paige was still sitting in her chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction surrounding her. The arrogant, entitled golden child was watching her entire universe vaporize in real time. Her heavy beaded designer gown suddenly looked like a straitjacket. Dark black streaks of expensive mascara were running rapidly down her pale cheeks. She looked at the stage where her husband had just been dragged away in handcuffs after publicly screaming that all the fraud was her fault. She looked at the side exit where her father was being marched out by federal agents. She looked at the center aisle where her mother had just begged on her knees before being hauled off to a holding cell. Paige slowly stood up from her chair, her legs trembling so violently she had to grab the table to steady herself. She looked around the grand ballroom. The wealthy socialites and billionaire investors, who she had so desperately wanted to impress, were now staring at her with profound pity and absolute disgust. The crushing reality of her situation finally hit her with brutal, unforgiving force. She was completely and utterly alone. She had no college degree. She had no job skills. She had absolutely no money. The massive suburban mansion she thought she owned was actively being seized by the federal government. Her husband was going to federal prison, and he was planning to drag her down with him to reduce his own sentence. And to make matters worse, she had just opened multiple high-interest credit cards to buy the exact dress and rent the exact diamonds she was currently wearing. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She had relentlessly mocked my nursing shifts, my cheap clothes, and my small apartment. But now the tables had violently and permanently turned. She was drowning in toxic debt with absolutely nowhere to go and no one left to save her. Paige locked eyes with me across the room. Her arrogant smirk was completely gone. Her toxic confidence had evaporated into nothing. She opened her trembling mouth, attempting to speak, attempting to beg for the exact same mercy her mother had just pleaded for. But no words came out. The absolute silence of her complete ruin was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal transport vans reflected brightly against the glass doors of the luxury hotel. I stood on the grand marble steps and watched the vehicles pull away into the freezing Boston night. Inside those heavily armored vans were the people who had spent their entire lives trying to break me. Howard and Sylvia were gone. Kendrick was gone. I pulled the lapels of my navy blue blazer a little closer to my chest. The crisp winter wind felt absolutely incredible. It was the first time in my entire life that I was breathing completely free air. The legal fallout over the next few weeks was a masterclass in swift federal justice. The United States government does not play games when it comes to massive wire fraud and the theft of intellectual property. 3 days after the spectacular collapse at the medical gala, I walked into the federal courthouse in downtown Boston. I sat quietly in the back row of the gallery to watch Kendrick face his initial arraignment. I was not wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo anymore. He was marched into the room, wearing a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were chained together, making his arrogant swagger completely impossible. He looked exhausted and terrified. His public defender desperately tried to argue for bail, claiming Kendrick was a respected local business owner who posed absolutely no flight risk. The federal prosecutor did not even raise his voice. He simply handed the judge a printed stack of documents. He presented the digital receipts of Kendrick liquidating $5 million into offshore accounts. Then he placed the printed one-way first-class boarding pass to Dubai right on the judge's bench. The judge took one look at the evidence and slammed his wooden gavel down with absolute finality. Bail was instantly denied. The judge stared Kendrick right in the eye and informed him that he was facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. Kendrick collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his chained hands as the marshals dragged him back to his holding cell. He was going to spend the next 2 decades in a concrete box. While Kendrick was locked away, the federal authorities initiated a total and ruthless asset forfeiture against my adoptive parents. Howard and Sylvia were sitting in their own separate federal holding facilities, waiting for their grand larceny trial. They thought they had perfectly hidden my stolen money inside their massive real estate purchases, but forensic accountants are relentless. The government seized the sprawling suburban mansion immediately. I actually drove out to the affluent neighborhood just to watch the United States Marshals place massive, bright neon seizure notices across those heavy oak front doors. A fleet of moving trucks arrived to empty the house. Every single piece of imported designer furniture, every expensive painting, and every piece of fine china was boxed up and hauled off to a government auction. The millions of dollars they had siphoned from my biological mother's estate were systematically liquidated to pay back the Vanderbilt Trust. In a matter of weeks, the pristine, perfect image Howard and Sylvia had sacrificed my sanity to build was completely erased from the earth. The most satisfying downfall, however, belonged entirely to Paige. When the federal government seized the mansion, Paige was physically thrown out into the street. The predatory high-interest credit cards she had opened to buy her lavish gala gown instantly went into default. She tried to return the heavily beaded dress and the rented diamonds, but the debt collectors had already flagged her accounts. Because Howard and Sylvia had spoiled her entire life, she had absolutely no college degree and zero marketable skills. She could not rely on her fake tech billionaire husband because his assets were frozen and he was facing a 20-year prison sentence. A month later, I was driving through a rundown industrial section of the city. I stopped at a red light and glanced over at a cheap, greasy fast food diner. Through the dirty glass window, I saw Paige. The golden child of the family was wearing a stained, ill-fitting polyester uniform. She was holding a dirty rag and scrubbing a sticky plastic table for minimum wage. She looked exhausted, her hair tied back in a messy knot, her face completely drained of its usual toxic arrogance. She had been forced to rent a tiny roach-infested studio apartment in one of the worst neighborhoods in Boston just to avoid sleeping on the streets. She had spent her entire life mocking my nursing scrubs and treating me like a peasant. Now she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, completely abandoned by the high society she had tried so desperately to infiltrate. I watched her wipe down the table, and then the traffic light turned green. I drove away and never looked back. Later that same afternoon, I walked into the highest executive boardroom of the university legal department. The long mahogany table was covered in neat stacks of official federal paperwork. Dr. Gregory Pierce stood by the window smiling warmly as I walked into the room. David Caldwell, the senior legal counsel, pulled out a heavy leather chair for me. David slid the very first document across the table. It was a court order signed by a federal judge officially and permanently dissolving the fraudulent guardianship Howard and Sylvia had held over me. My stolen identity was completely restored. I picked up a gold pen and smoothly signed my true legal name on the bottom line. Then came the final massive stack of financial documents. Because the government had successfully recovered and liquidated the stolen assets, the trust fund was fully stabilized. David explained that the Board of Trustees had unanimously voted to expedite the transfer of power. I signed the remaining pages, taking absolute legal and financial control of the $80 million Elise Vanderbilt Trust. I was officially handed the full patent rights to the cardiovascular stents my biological mother had invented. I set the pen down and looked at the signed papers. The decades of poverty, the freezing nights sleeping in my car, the endless double shifts and the constant emotional abuse were officially over. I had taken back every single thing they stole from me. I had burned their fake empire to the ground and reclaimed my mother's legendary legacy. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of my own future. 6 months passed since the ink dried on those federal documents, and my entire reality was permanently rewritten. The bitter, freezing winter that had almost broken me gave way to a crisp, bright autumn in Boston. I sat in the back of a sleek, understated black town car, watching the historic architecture of the city roll past the tinted windows. I was not driving my freezing 12-year-old Honda Civic anymore. I had donated that old car to a hardworking nursing student at my former hospital the very same week I took control of my inheritance. I did not need to flaunt my wealth with loud neon sports cars the way my fraudulent brother-in-law Kendrick once did. I had learned that real undeniable power moves quietly. The professional driver pulled smoothly up to the curb of the Boston University Medical School campus and stepped out to open my door. The crisp morning air felt incredibly fresh against my skin as I stepped out onto the pristine brick walkway. I was not walking into a federal courtroom today. I was walking into the rest of my life. I adjusted my clothing as I looked up at the towering campus buildings. I was wearing a brand new, perfectly pressed white medical student coat. I had not bought my way into this prestigious program with my mother's fortune. Despite taking absolute control of an $80 million trust fund, the admissions board had accepted me entirely based on my flawless clinical interview and my decade of grueling experience in the intensive care unit. But underneath that immaculate white coat, I was wearing something far more important. I was wearing the exact same navy blue blazer my adoptive sister Paige had tried to destroy. The massive jagged white bleach crater was still prominently visible on the left side of the fabric. I had explicitly ordered the master tailor to leave the chemical damage completely untouched. It was my permanent badge of honor. It was a daily physical reminder of the exact night my adoptive family tried to break my spirit and accidentally set me free. Woven directly into the exposed vintage silk, the solid gold Vanderbilt crest caught the bright autumn sunlight and shimmered brilliantly against my chest. As I walked down the main campus promenade, I thought about the people who had tried to erase that beautiful crest from existence. The federal justice system had delivered a crushing and absolute finality to their fake suburban empire. Just 2 weeks ago, Kendrick stood before a federal judge and received a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years in a maximum security penitentiary. His slick, arrogant tech founder persona was completely dead. He would spend the next 2 decades wearing a cheap government-issued uniform for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Howard and Sylvia, terrified of facing a ruthless federal prosecutor in front of a jury, took a rapid plea deal. My adoptive parents were currently serving separate 10-year sentences for grand larceny and financial exploitation. Their exclusive country club memberships and luxury international vacations were permanently traded for concrete walls and steel bars. The federal government had seized and liquidated every single asset they owned, returning millions of stolen dollars back into my accounts. And then there was Paige, the entitled golden child who had confidently thrown my faded nursing scrubs into the freezing snow, was currently experiencing the brutal, unforgiving reality of the real world. Without her parents' stolen money, and without her husband's fraudulent credit cards, she had absolutely nothing left. I had recently received a frantic, pathetic voicemail from her. She was begging me for a cash loan because she had just been evicted from her tiny roach-infested studio apartment after failing to hold down a minimum-wage retail job. She had spent 29 years mocking my relentless work ethic and acting like she was genetically superior to everyone else. Now she was completely bankrupt, socially isolated, and entirely forgotten by the wealthy Boston elites she had tried so desperately to impress. I deleted her sobbing voicemail without a single second of hesitation. My charity days were permanently over. I reached the end of the brick promenade and stopped in front of a massive, newly constructed state-of-the-art medical facility. The building was an absolute masterpiece of modern glass and polished steel. Standing right at the main entrance, waiting patiently for my arrival, was Dr. Gregory Pierce. The dean of the medical school gave me a warm, deeply respectful smile as I approached the plaza. He reached out and shook my hand firmly, officially, welcoming me to my very first day of medical school. We both turned our attention to the top of the sweeping glass double doors. Mounted securely against the pristine glass were massive, heavy silver letters that gleamed perfectly in the morning light. The sign read, "The Elise Vanderbilt Cardiovascular Research Center." I had used a sizable portion of my recovered trust fund to establish this permanent cutting-edge facility right on the university campus. The center was fully dedicated to advancing the exact life-saving technologies my biological mother had pioneered 25 years ago. Howard and Sylvia had tried to bury her name in the dirt and steal her legendary legacy just to buy designer bags and suburban mansions. Now her name was permanently etched into the absolute pinnacle of the American medical community, where it rightfully belonged, and her research would go on to save thousands of lives for generations to come. Dr. Pierce gestured toward the automatic doors, and told me the surgical research teams inside were incredibly eager to meet the woman who had made this entire center possible. The wealthy students walking past us stopped and looked at me with clear admiration and deep respect. They did not see a tired, struggling nurse anymore. I took a deep, steadying breath. I looked down at the gold crest resting squarely over my heart. I was no longer the exhausted, overworked scapegoat quietly enduring a lifetime of emotional abuse. I stepped through the glass doors not as a victim, but as Dr. Elise Vanderbilt's daughter. I had taken back every single thing they stole, and I had built a legendary empire they could never touch. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that the exact weapons people use to destroy you can ultimately expose your greatest strength. For a decade, I accepted the toxic narrative my adoptive family created to keep me compliant. When my sister poured bleach on my blazer, she intended to completely ruin my future. Instead, she burned away the cheap facade they forced me to wear and revealed the golden legacy I was born to claim. True power comes from knowing your own worth. Have you ever turned a painful betrayal into a massive victory? Let me know your story in the comments below.